She defended a young Apache when deputies beat him. Then 176 Apaches showed up at her cabin. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a soft orange glow across the vast, barren landscape. A young woman, dressed in simple clothes, stood at the edge of the dirt road leading to her cabin. She had lived alone for years, far from any town, isolated from the chaos of the world. Her cabin, a modest structure made of wood and stone, was surrounded by the stillness of the American wilderness. But this silence would soon be shattered. From a distance, she heard the sound of horses approaching, their hooves striking the dry earth with a rhythmic beat. She stood still, her eyes narrowing as the figures came into view. It was a group of lawmen, 5 deputies on horseback, riding toward her cabin with purpose. She had seen them before, hardened men, with faces etched by years of dealing with criminals and outlaws. But today, they weren't chasing bandits or criminals. Today, they had come for something else. The young woman's gaze shifted to the figure they were escorting. A young Apache boy, no older than 14, was riding in the middle of the group. His face was bruised, his clothes torn. It was clear that he had been beaten. Her heart sank as she recognized him. She had seen this boy many times before. He lived in the nearby Apache camp, just a few miles from her cabin. His name was Takoda, and he had always been kind, a quiet boy who loved the land as much as she did. But now, he was being dragged through the dirt like an animal. The deputies halted their horses in front of her cabin. The leader, a tall man with a grizzled face, dismounted first. His eyes scanned the young woman briefly, but he said nothing. The other deputies followed suit, but they too remained silent, their expressions unreadable. "What is this about?" the woman asked, her voice steady, though her hands clenched into fists. The leader of the deputies stepped forward, a smirk crossing his lips. "This boy," he said, pointing to Takoda, "has been causing trouble with the local settlers. We're just doing our job." He motioned for the boy to be dismounted, and Takoda stumbled as he was forced down from his horse. The woman could see the fear in his eyes, the way he winced as he tried to steady himself. She knew then that something was wrong. She had always respected the law, but this was different. This wasn't about justice. This was about cruelty. Takoda had done nothing wrong. She was sure of it. As the deputies laughed among themselves, making cruel jokes about the boy's tribe, the woman's anger flared. She couldn't stand by and watch any longer. She stepped forward, her voice rising. "Enough," she shouted. The deputies stopped talking and looked at her in surprise. "You're hurting him," she said, her voice firm. "He didn't do anything wrong." The leader of the deputies sneered at her. "What's this? A bleeding heart for the savages?" he mocked. The woman took a deep breath, her heart pounding in her chest. She had no idea what would happen next, but she knew she had to act. She stepped between the deputies and Takoda, blocking them from moving any closer. "You're not taking him," she said, her voice steady. "Not like this." For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. The deputies stared at her, their eyes filled with disbelief. But then, as if they had all come to an unspoken agreement, the leader pulled out his revolver. "You'll regret this," he warned, his voice cold. The woman's heart raced, but she didn't move. She had never been a fighter, but she had something they didn't, something that couldn't be taken away. She had courage. As the tension in the air thickened, something unexpected happened. The sound of galloping horses echoed in the distance. The deputies turned to look, their faces tightening with apprehension. And then, out of the dust and the setting sun, a group of riders appeared on the horizon. At first, it seemed like just a few, but as they rode closer, the number became clear. It wasn't just a handful. It was an entire tribe. 176 Apache warriors rode toward the woman's cabin, their faces painted with war markings, their eyes fierce and determined. The deputies froze. The woman's heart raced, not with fear, but with something else. She had just become the center of a storm. Takoda looked at her, his eyes wide with awe and gratitude. He had known the Apache would come for him, but not like this. Not in such a way. She had unknowingly become a hero in their eyes, and now, they were here. They had come to repay the kindness she had shown one of their own. The deputies, stunned and outnumbered, took a step back. The leader's hand twitched toward his revolver again, but it was too late. The Apache warriors surrounded them, dismounting in a flash, their movements swift and practiced. The air crackled with tension as the warriors stood in silence, their eyes locked on the deputies. The woman felt a sense of power she had never known before, not from the warriors, but from the righteousness of her own actions. She had done the right thing, and now, the world had come to her door to show that justice would not be silenced. The warriors stood silently, surrounding the deputies like a storm closing in. The woman, still standing between the Apache boy and the lawmen, felt a surge of mixed emotions. Fear, pride, and confusion swirled inside her. She had never expected anything like this, not in her wildest dreams. What had started as an act of kindness was now turning into something far more complicated. Takoda, still standing behind her, seemed both relieved and terrified, his wide eyes darting between the lawmen and the Apache warriors. The warriors were a living wall of strength and discipline. Each one carried the weight of centuries of history, and now, they were here for one reason: justice. The leader of the Apache warriors, a tall man with weathered features and sharp, calculating eyes, stepped forward. He locked eyes with the deputy leader, who had begun to sweat, his hand still hovering near his revolver. "You are on Apache land," the leader spoke in a low, rumbling voice that carried the weight of authority. "You have no right to harm this boy." The deputies remained frozen, unsure of how to respond. They had been outnumbered and outgunned, but there was something even more powerful in the air, the righteous anger of the Apache people. The woman could feel the weight of their gaze on her, and in that moment, she realized the gravity of what she had done. She had become the catalyst for this confrontation, and there was no turning back. The Apache leader continued, his voice unwavering. "The boy you beat is a son of our tribe, and anyone who harms our children will answer to us." The deputy leader stepped back, his face pale, but his pride refused to let him back down completely. "We were just doing our job," he muttered weakly. The Apache leader didn't flinch. "Your job is to uphold justice, not to bring harm to the innocent." Silence hung in the air, thick with tension. The warriors, still standing at attention, never wavered. The woman felt a surge of admiration for them, and in that moment, she understood. They weren't here to fight. They were here to protect. She had unknowingly become a part of their story, and now, they would make sure justice was served. The deputy leader finally spoke, his voice faltering. "We didn't know," he said, his tone defensive. "We thought he was a troublemaker." The Apache leader's eyes narrowed. "You judged him because of his blood, not his actions. You made an enemy out of us all." The lawmen seemed to shrink under the weight of the warrior's words. The leader turned his attention to the woman, his gaze softening just slightly. "You did what was right," he said. "You saved this boy, and for that, we honor you." The woman felt a lump rise in her throat. She had never expected anything like this. She had only acted because it was the right thing to do, but now, standing before these warriors, she realized how much her small act of kindness had meant. She nodded, grateful but humbled. The leader gestured to Takoda, who was standing behind her, still recovering from the beating. "Bring him to us," he said. The woman stepped aside, allowing Takoda to move forward. As he walked past her, she could see the relief in his eyes, and for the first time since this ordeal had begun, she could breathe a little easier. The warriors formed a loose circle around Takoda, their presence both protective and commanding. The woman watched as they spoke to him in their native tongue, their voices soft but firm. They were reassuring him, comforting him, and making sure he knew he was safe now. The deputy leader watched nervously, clearly unsure of what to do. The woman could sense that he was waiting for some kind of instruction, but there was nothing to be done now. The Apache had already made their decision. "Leave now," the Apache leader commanded. "Before you make this worse." The deputies didn't need to be told twice. With one final glance at the warriors, they mounted their horses and rode off, their heads hung low in defeat. The warriors watched them go, and when they were out of sight, the leader turned back to the woman. "Thank you for your courage," he said. "You have earned our respect." The woman didn't know what to say. All she had done was stand up for what was right, but somehow, it had turned into something far bigger than she had ever imagined. Takoda came to stand beside her, his eyes filled with gratitude. "You saved me," he said softly. She smiled at him, the weight of the moment finally sinking in. "I didn't do it alone," she said, glancing at the Apache warriors. "They came to protect you, and they will always protect you." The Apache leader nodded. "We are a people of honor, and we never forget those who help us." The woman's heart swelled with pride. She had never expected anything like this, but now, standing here with these warriors, she understood. Justice had been served, not through violence or force, but through a simple act of kindness, and the world had taken notice. Takoda looked up at her, his face serious but full of respect. "You're one of us now," he said quietly. "You have our thanks." The woman looked around at the warriors, at the land they protected, and for the first time, she felt truly at home. She had done something good, and now, she had a place in their world, a world where justice and honor were more important than anything else. The sun had begun to set, painting the sky in shades of gold and purple. The woman stood outside her cabin, watching the Apache warriors as they prepared to leave. The leader, who had spoken with such authority earlier, approached her once more. His expression was no longer one of judgment, but of understanding and respect. "You have done something rare today," he said, his voice softening slightly. "In a world where many turn their backs on those in need, you chose to stand up for what is right." The woman nodded, feeling the weight of his words settle deep inside her. She had done what anyone would have done, hadn't she? It had seemed like the only choice. But now, surrounded by the warriors and their unshakable presence, she realized that her simple act of courage had somehow changed everything. Takoda, still standing beside her, looked up at her with admiration. "You saved my life," he said quietly. "I don't know how to thank you." The woman smiled down at him, brushing a strand of hair from his face. "You don't need to thank me," she replied. "I did what was right." As she spoke those words, a feeling of peace washed over her. For the first time, she felt truly at ease with her decisions. The Apache leader motioned to his warriors. "We have to go," he said, his voice firm again. "But we will not forget you." The warriors mounted their horses, their movements synchronized and fluid. The woman watched as they rode away, their figures blending into the fading light of the evening. Takoda turned to her, his face filled with a mix of gratitude and confusion. "What happens now?" he asked. She paused, considering his question carefully. What had happened now? The world around them had shifted, but what did that mean for her and for him? "Now," she said slowly, "we live." Takoda nodded, though he didn't fully understand the depth of her words. He had been caught in the storm of something much bigger than himself, but for now, he was safe. And so was she. The woman turned back toward her cabin, the doors still wide open from the earlier confrontation. The evening air had grown cooler, and the night was beginning to creep in. The weight of the past few hours pressed down on her, but there was no fear in her heart, only a deep sense of resolve. As she stepped inside, Takoda followed her, his eyes still filled with questions. "What will happen to me now?" he asked once more. She motioned for him to sit by the fire. "You'll stay here for as long as you need," she said, her voice calm and steady. "I owe you nothing, but I will protect you." He looked at her with a mixture of awe and disbelief. "Why?" he asked simply. "Because it is right," she replied. "Because every life matters. Yours included." Takoda sat in silence for a moment, absorbing her words. The crackling of the fire was the only sound in the room as the flames danced, casting flickering shadows across the walls. Outside, the wind had picked up, the sounds of the wilderness carrying through the night. But inside, there was only the warmth of the fire and the quiet companionship between two souls who had found each other in a world that often seemed to overlook the vulnerable. The woman looked out the window, watching the last of the Apache warriors disappear into the distance. For a brief moment, she thought she saw the leader glance back, his eyes meeting hers in the fading light. There was no fear in his gaze, only respect. She knew that the road ahead would not be easy. There would be more challenges, more moments where right and wrong would blur into something unrecognizable. But for now, she had done what she could. She had protected someone who needed her, and in doing so, she had found her place in a world that often seemed so divided. Takoda, still sitting quietly, looked up at her again. "I'll never forget what you did for me," he said softly. She smiled, her heart lighter than it had been all day. "Then we are even," she replied. The fire crackled louder, the sound filling the room as the night embraced them both. Outside, the stars were beginning to twinkle in the clear sky, a reminder of the endless possibilities that lay ahead. And as she sat down beside Takoda, the woman felt a deep sense of peace. In a world that often seemed ruled by fear and misunderstanding, she had found something rare, a chance to make a real difference. And in that moment, she knew she had chosen the right path. The days passed slowly at the cabin, but the woman never forgot the presence of the Apache warriors that had come to her door. They had left the valley, their mission complete, but their words and their promise of protection remained in her mind. She was not used to being a part of something larger than herself. For so long, she had lived in isolation, and now, she was inexplicably woven into the fabric of their world. Takoda, the young Apache boy she had saved, stayed close to her during those days. His wounds had healed, but the scars, both physical and emotional, remained. He was a quiet boy, but his gratitude was evident in everything he did. He helped with the chores around the cabin, chopping firewood, gathering water, and sometimes sitting silently beside her as she worked. The bond between them was growing, though neither spoke of it openly. The woman often caught him staring at her with a mixture of awe and confusion, as if he couldn't quite understand why she had done what she did. One evening, as the sky turned a deep indigo, Takoda approached her as she was tending to the fire. "You saved me," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I don't understand. Why did you do it?" The question hung in the air, and the woman looked up at him, the flames flickering in her eyes. She paused for a moment before responding, the weight of her answer pressing on her chest. "Because it was the right thing to do," she replied simply. "Because every life matters, Takoda, including yours." Takoda looked down at his hands, the weight of her words settling on his shoulders. "But I'm just a boy," he said quietly. The woman smiled gently. "You are a boy, yes. But that doesn't make your life any less valuable." Takoda nodded slowly, though he still seemed to struggle with her reasoning. He had grown up in a world where people like him were often seen as less than, as invisible. She had shown him that this was not true, but it would take time for him to truly understand. The next few days were peaceful, but the woman could feel the shift in the air. It was as if the world was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. She couldn't shake the feeling that the Apache warrior's visit was only the beginning of something much larger. She couldn't forget the warning the Apache leader had given her. "You have earned our respect," he had said. "But others may not see you the same way." The woman knew the truth of his words. She had already seen how easily people could turn against one another. The sheriff and his deputies were proof of that. And though the Apache had shown her kindness, she knew the world outside her cabin was not as forgiving. Takoda had been a symbol of that cruelty, and she feared that his presence in her life might bring more trouble. She couldn't help but worry about the consequences of her actions. One evening, as she and Takoda sat outside the cabin, a figure appeared on the horizon. At first, it looked like a lone rider, but as they got closer, the woman's heart sank. It was a group of riders, at least 5 of them, approaching at a steady pace. The woman stood up, her hand instinctively going to the rifle resting against the cabin wall. Takoda stood beside her, his eyes wide with concern. "Who are they?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The woman squinted into the distance. She couldn't make out their faces, but she could tell by the way they rode that they were not Apache. "I don't know," she said, her voice tight with worry. "But we'll find out soon enough." As the riders drew closer, the woman's suspicions were confirmed. These were not friends. They were lawmen. She could see the badges glinting in the fading sunlight, their horses moving with purpose as they came to a stop just outside the cabin. The leader of the group dismounted first, a tall man with a stern expression. He looked at the woman with a mix of curiosity and suspicion. "Are you the one who interfered with the deputies last week?" he asked, his voice rough. The woman didn't flinch. "Yes," she replied firmly. "I stood up for what was right." The lawman's eyes narrowed. "And now you're harboring an Apache boy?" The woman didn't hesitate. "He is not just an Apache boy. He is a child, and he deserves protection like any other child." The lawman stepped forward, his hand resting on the hilt of his gun. "You're making a dangerous mistake," he said. We have laws in this land, and those laws must be upheld. The woman's heart raced, but she stood her ground. And what if the law is wrong? She asked. The lawman scoffed. The law is never wrong, he snapped. You'd do well to remember that. The woman's mind raced. She knew this confrontation was inevitable. She had expected it, but now that it was here, she didn't know how to handle it. Takoda, who had been standing quietly by her side, stepped forward. She did nothing wrong, he said in a steady voice. She saved me. She is a good person. The lawman turned his cold gaze on Takoda, his expression hardening. And what would you know about right and wrong, boy? He sneered. Takoda didn't back down. I know what she did for me, he said quietly. And I know she's the only reason I'm still alive. The lawman's eyes flicked between the two of them, his jaw tightening. He clearly didn't know what to make of this situation. Finally, he nodded curtly. We'll be back, he said, turning to mount his horse. And next time, there will be consequences. As they rode off, the woman exhaled slowly, her body sagging with relief. But deep down, she knew this was far from over. The storm was just beginning. The night after the lawman had ridden away, the woman could feel the tension in the air. The wind howled through the cracks in the cabin walls, as if carrying the weight of the threat that hung over them. Takoda had gone to bed early, exhausted from the stress of the past few days, but the woman couldn't sleep. She sat by the window, staring out into the dark wilderness, her thoughts racing. The deputies had promised to return, and she knew they would. The law was on their side, and she was just one woman against the system. But she also knew one thing. She could not turn her back on what was right. The world outside her cabin was filled with so much injustice, and every day, it seemed like more and more people were willing to ignore it. That was why she had acted, why she had protected Takoda. He was just a boy, yet his people were treated like they didn't belong, like they were less than. She couldn't stand by and let that happen. It wasn't in her to be passive. Her heart still pounded when she thought about the lawman who had confronted her earlier. His threats were real, and she had seen the anger in his eyes. But there was something else there too, something deeper, something more human. He wasn't just a faceless figure of authority. He was a man who had been shaped by the world he lived in, just as she had been. She couldn't help but wonder what would happen if she could make him see the truth. If she could make him see that there was more to the world than just the laws that had been written in books. Maybe, just maybe, there was a way to change things. But she wasn't foolish enough to think it would be easy. The world had a way of punishing those who stood against it, and she was no different. She had already seen what the law was willing to do to a young boy, and she knew that they wouldn't stop there. They would come for her, too. The thought weighed heavily on her mind, but she knew that running was not an option. She would stand her ground, no matter what. As the hours passed, the quiet of the night seemed to close in on her, making the cabin feel even smaller. Her thoughts wandered back to the Apache warriors, the ones who had come to her aid, the ones who had promised to protect her. They had left, but their words echoed in her mind. We will not forget you. She didn't know what that meant exactly, but she could feel their presence in her heart. They were a people of honor, and she had earned their respect. But would it be enough to protect her when the law came knocking? The next morning, the silence of the night seemed to linger, stretching into the early hours of the day. Takoda woke up first, as usual, and came to sit by the fire. He was quiet, as if he knew the gravity of the situation. The woman looked at him, feeling a deep sense of responsibility. He was young, just a boy, but he had already seen more violence and cruelty than most people ever would. He had already been forced to grow up too fast. Do you think they'll come for us? He asked, his voice soft but filled with worry. The woman didn't answer right away. She didn't want to lie to him, but she also didn't want to scare him. Instead, she reached out and took his hand. We'll be ready, she said simply. Whatever happens, we'll face it together. Takoda nodded, though his eyes betrayed the fear he felt inside. The woman could see it in the way he clenched his fists, the way his jaw tightened. He was trying to be brave, but she knew that the weight of the world was bearing down on him. As they sat there in the quiet cabin, the woman couldn't help but feel a sense of dread settling in her stomach. She had done what was right, but was that enough? Would it be enough to protect them when the law came to take Takoda away? She had no way of knowing. The world outside her cabin was full of unknowns, full of dangers and threats she couldn't predict. But one thing was certain, she couldn't sit idly by. She had to act. She couldn't let the law take Takoda or anyone else, without standing up for them. And so, she made a decision. She would leave the cabin, go into the town, and confront the authorities. She would make them see the truth. She would make them understand that what they were doing was wrong. It was a dangerous decision, but she knew it was the only way. Takoda, still sitting by the fire, looked up at her. "What are you going to do?" he asked, his voice filled with concern. The woman stood up slowly, her mind already made up. "I'm going to make sure this stops," she said firmly. "I'm going to make them listen." Takoda stood too, his eyes wide with uncertainty. "But you can't do this alone," he said. The woman smiled, though there was a sadness in her eyes. "I won't be alone, Takoda," she said softly. "I have you." Takoda's eyes softened, and for the first time, she saw a glimmer of hope in his expression. He didn't fully understand what was happening, but he trusted her. He believed in her. And that, she realized, was all that mattered. As they stood together in the cabin, facing an uncertain future, the woman knew one thing for sure. She was ready to fight for what was right. She had no idea what would happen next, but she knew she couldn't back down. The law would come for them, but they would not go quietly. They would stand their ground, and together, they would show the world that justice could still be fought for, even in the face of overwhelming odds. The next morning came with an uneasy stillness. The woman had not slept, her mind racing with the events of the day before. She knew that her decision to confront the law would come with consequences. It was inevitable. Yet, she couldn't shake the feeling that it was the only thing she could do. As the first light of day poured through the cabin's windows, she turned to Takoda, who was already awake and standing by the door. His eyes were filled with a mixture of apprehension and admiration. "Are you sure about this?" he asked, his voice steady but tinged with concern. The woman gave him a soft smile, though she knew the weight of her words would not be easy to carry. "Yes," she said simply. "We can't wait any longer. It's time to make them listen." Takoda nodded, though his eyes betrayed the worry he felt. He had come to trust her, but he still couldn't fully comprehend the danger that lay ahead. For him, the world had always been simple. Do what you're told, follow the rules. But now, standing at the edge of something bigger, he was learning that sometimes the rules are wrong, and someone has to stand up against them. The woman strapped on her boots, grabbed her rifle, and walked toward the door. Takoda followed, still unsure of what would happen next. They both knew they couldn't turn back. As they made their way toward the small town several miles away, the air felt thick with anticipation. The woman's heart pounded in her chest, but there was no room for fear. She had to do this, not just for Takoda, but for herself. She had spent so many years living in isolation, avoiding confrontation, keeping her head down. But now, she was no longer an observer. She was part of the story, and it was time to play her part. The road to town was long and dusty, the sun beating down on them as they walked side by side, the only sounds being the crunch of dirt beneath their boots and the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. Takoda walked silently, glancing up at the woman now and then, as if trying to gauge her resolve. They had both heard rumors of the lawmen's brutality, how they had taken matters into their own hands, dispensing justice as they saw fit. The woman had witnessed it firsthand when they had beaten Takoda, but she knew there was more to this than just one. Boy, the lawmen's cruelty was a symptom of a much larger problem. As they approached the town, the woman could see the small cluster of buildings on the horizon. A few scattered houses, the general store, the sheriff's office. It was a quiet place, the kind of town where everyone knew everyone else's business. And in a town like this, the woman knew, things could change quickly. She could already feel the weight of the eyes that would be upon her, the whispers that would follow her every step. As they entered the town, they walked past the general store, where a few people were gathered, talking in hushed voices. They glanced at the woman and Takoda, but said nothing. The woman kept her head held high, not allowing the uncertainty in the air to shake her. They reached the sheriff's office without incident, and the woman felt a surge of determination. This was it. Takoda stood by her side, his hand resting on the strap of his satchel. The woman could feel his nervousness, but she also felt his trust in her. She placed a hand on his shoulder, offering a silent reassurance. She could hear the distant sounds of the town coming to life, the clanging of a hammer, the murmur of voices, but she focused on the door in front of her. She knocked once, firmly, and waited. The door creaked open, revealing a man behind a desk, his back to them. The woman didn't wait for him to speak. She stepped inside, her voice steady. "I need to speak to the sheriff." The man turned slowly, his expression neutral but curious. "What's this about?" he asked, eyeing the rifle slung over her shoulder. "It's about justice," she replied, her voice unwavering. "It's about right and wrong." The sheriff's office felt smaller than she had imagined, the air thick with the smell of stale wood and dust. The man behind the desk didn't seem threatening at first, but she could tell by the way his eyes darted to the door that he was trying to gauge her intentions. "I'm listening," he said after a pause, leaning forward in his chair. The woman took a deep breath and began to speak, laying out the events that had led her here, the cruelty of the deputies, and the injustice that had been done to Takoda. She spoke with clarity, her words cutting through the air like the sharp edge of a knife. Takoda stood behind her, silent but alert. The sheriff listened, his expression unchanged, though his fingers tapped nervously on the desk. When she finished, there was a long silence. Finally, the sheriff spoke, his voice low. "You're asking me to go against the law," he said, his tone heavy. "That's not something I can do." The woman didn't flinch. "The law is supposed to protect people, not harm them," she replied, her eyes locked on his. "What's happening here is wrong, and I won't stand by and let it continue." The sheriff's face hardened, but he didn't speak right away. The woman could feel the weight of the moment, the tension that filled the room. She had done everything she could to make him understand, but she knew that sometimes the truth wasn't enough to change someone's mind. Takoda stepped forward, his voice quiet but full of conviction. "She's right," he said. "What they did to me wasn't right. What they're doing to people like me isn't right, and it needs to stop." The sheriff looked at the boy, his expression faltering for a moment. For a split second, the woman thought she saw a hint of doubt in his eyes. But just as quickly, it disappeared. "I can't make those decisions," the sheriff said, standing up from his desk. "You'll have to take it up with someone higher." The woman's heart sank. She had hoped for more, but this was the world they lived in, a world where the law didn't always work for justice. But she wasn't going to give up. Not now. Not ever. The following day, as the woman and Takoda returned to their cabin, a heavy silence hung between them. The town, once so quiet and distant, now felt oppressive, like the walls were closing in. She had hoped for a breakthrough at the sheriff's office, but instead, she had left feeling more uncertain than ever. The sheriff's refusal to act was a blow, but she knew this was only the beginning. The lawmen had grown bolder, and the world they lived in was about to change. Takoda walked beside her, his thoughts hidden behind his quiet expression. She could see the weight of the situation on his shoulders, and yet, he said nothing. She knew that he, too, understood the gravity of the moment. As they reached the cabin, the woman stopped and looked out across the land that stretched out before them. The wind blew softly through the trees, and for a brief moment, the world seemed at peace again. But deep inside, she could feel the storm that was coming. She didn't know when it would arrive, but she knew it was inevitable. They had made their stand, and now there was no turning back. The woman felt a hand on her shoulder. She turned to find Takoda standing behind her, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and determination. "What now?" he asked quietly, his voice unsure. The woman gave him a steady look. "Now we wait," she said. "But we won't just wait. We'll be ready. When they come for us, we'll stand our ground." Takoda nodded slowly, his fingers curling around the strap of his satchel. The woman could see the unease in his eyes, but there was something else there too, something like resolve. He had come a long way since she had first met him, and now he was ready to fight for what was right. She placed a hand on his shoulder, offering silent support. They had both come to understand that their battle wasn't just about them. It was about something much bigger. The world was changing, and they had a role to play in it. That night, as the woman lay awake in bed, the sound of hooves echoed in the distance. At first, she thought it was nothing, just the wind, or perhaps a passing animal. But then the sound grew louder, closer, and she knew. The lawmen were coming. She sat up in bed, her heart racing. Takoda was still asleep beside her, but she knew it wouldn't be long before he would wake. She moved quickly, grabbing her rifle and checking the window. The moonlight illuminated the land outside, casting long shadows on the ground. The silhouettes of horses moved slowly across the horizon. She knew they were close now. The lawmen were coming for them. The woman stood still, her mind focused. This was it, the moment she had been preparing for. Takoda stirred beside her, his eyes opening slowly. "What's happening?" he asked, his voice groggy from sleep. She looked at him, her expression calm but determined. "They're here," she said simply. "Stay close to me, Takoda. We'll face this together." The sound of hooves grew louder, and soon, the lawmen were at the cabin door. There was no turning back now. The woman took a deep breath and stepped to the door, her rifle ready. Takoda stood beside her, his small hand gripping hers for support. Together, they waited for the knock. When it came, it was forceful and deliberate. The woman opened the door, her eyes locking with the leader of the group, the same deputy she had confronted in town. He was flanked by two others, their faces grim. "You know why we're here," the deputy said, his voice cold and firm. "You've caused enough trouble already. This ends now." The woman's heart pounded in her chest, but she didn't flinch. "I did what I had to do," she replied, her voice steady. "You don't get to decide what's right or wrong." The deputy's eyes narrowed. "You're protecting a criminal," he spat. "And for that, we'll make sure you pay the price." The woman could feel Takoda's hand tighten in hers, his body trembling with fear. But she remained calm. She had prepared for this moment. "You may think you have the law on your side," she said, "but there's more to justice than what you carry in your pocket." The deputy scoffed, his hand twitching toward his gun. "You're making a mistake," he said, stepping closer. The woman's grip on her rifle tightened. This was no longer just about Takoda. This was about standing up to the very system that had oppressed people like him for so long. She wasn't going to let them take him away. Not without a fight. "I'm not afraid of you," she said firmly, her voice unwavering. "And I'm not afraid to protect what's right." The deputy hesitated, his hand still hovering near his holster. For a brief moment, the silence between them seemed to stretch on forever. But then, just as the tension reached its peak, a new sound cut through the air, another set of hooves. The deputy turned, his eyes widening. The woman didn't need to look to know what it meant. The Apache were coming. Takoda looked up at her, his face a mix of confusion and hope. "Are they here for us?" he asked softly. The woman gave him a small, reassuring smile. "Yes," she said. "They've come to make sure we don't stand alone." As the Apache warriors emerged from the shadows, the lawmen took a step back. The woman stood tall, her rifle in hand, with Takoda beside her. The warriors had arrived, and with them, the promise of protection. The deputy leader knew the game had changed. With one final glance at the woman, he turned and gestured to his men. "This isn't over," he said, his voice low. "We'll be back." But the woman didn't flinch. She knew they would come again, but now, she had something they didn't. A community, a tribe, and the unyielding belief that they could change the world. The Apache warriors stood in a circle around her cabin, their presence like a shield, guarding against the storm that was sure to follow. The days that followed felt like a battle between hope and fear, the tension hanging in the air like a storm that refused to break. The Apache warriors had remained by her side, protecting the woman and Takoda from the lawmen, but they had made it clear that they were not here for a fight. They were here for justice. Yet the lawmen would not back down so easily. They had already made it clear that they were determined to bring the woman and the boy to justice in their own eyes. The Apache leader, who had shown such resolve when he stood by the woman in the face of the lawmen, now sat by the fire, his gaze distant, as if weighing the consequences of what was to come. The woman had been unable to shake the feeling that the world was about to change in ways she couldn't predict. Takoda sat beside her, still recovering from the trauma of the previous days. He didn't speak much, but the look in his eyes told the woman that he was trying to make sense of everything. He had gone from being a boy in danger to a symbol of something bigger. But for him, the danger was far from over. The woman knew that Takoda needed more than just protection. He needed to understand that his voice mattered. They all needed to understand that their voices mattered. The Apache leader spoke softly, breaking the silence that had settled over the group. "We have to decide what happens next," he said, his voice steady, but the weight of his words heavy. "The lawmen will return, and we cannot avoid them. Forever." The woman nodded, her thoughts racing. "What do you propose?" she asked, her voice steady despite the uncertainty in her heart. The leader looked at her, his eyes sharp, yet filled with something like understanding. "We cannot keep running," he said. "We will stand together. We will show them that we will not be silenced." The woman felt a fire stir within her. She had already made her decision. Then let's stand, she said, her voice growing firm. Let's show them that what's right is not just about laws or power. It's about truth. It's about what we know is just. The Apache warriors around the fire nodded in agreement. Takoda, still sitting quietly beside her, looked up at the woman with newfound determination. I'm with you, he said softly, though his voice carried the weight of someone who had seen too much. The woman placed a hand on his shoulder. I know you are, Takoda, she said quietly. And together, we will make them listen. The next day, the woman and the Apache warriors made their way into town. Takoda walked beside her, his eyes scanning the horizon. He had never been to town before, but today, it felt like the world was opening up before him. The lawmen may have tried to silence them, but now they had a purpose that was bigger than any of them. They were fighting for something more than just survival. They were fighting for justice, for truth, and for the right to be heard. As they approached the center of town, the woman could feel the eyes of the townsfolk on them. Whispers filled the air, but the woman kept her head high, her back straight. She knew what she had to do. They made their way to the sheriff's office. The door was slightly ajar, and as the woman pushed it open, she found the sheriff seated at his desk, his eyes wide with surprise. You again, he said, his voice gruff. I told you before, this isn't over. The woman stepped forward, her voice unwavering. No, Sheriff, it is over, she said. Today, we put an end to this. The sheriff stood up, his hand resting on the gun at his belt. You're making a mistake, he warned. The law is on our side. The woman's eyes narrowed. The law does not always bring justice, she replied. You have the power to change things, but you choose not to. The sheriff hesitated, his eyes flicking between her and the group of Apache warriors standing behind her. I don't have a choice, he muttered. The law is the law. The woman stepped closer, her voice low but fierce. The law is what you make of it, she said. And right now, you're choosing to protect a broken system. But it's not too late to change that. The sheriff's gaze faltered, his hand dropping from his gun. He looked at the Apache warriors, and for the first time, the woman saw a flicker of doubt in his eyes. I don't know if I can change anything, he admitted quietly. The woman's heart raced. You can, she said. All it takes is the courage to do what's right. The sheriff stood silently for a moment, his eyes fixed on the floor. Then, with a deep breath, he looked up. I'll speak to the mayor, he said, his voice hoarse. I'll try to make this right. The woman didn't know if the sheriff would follow through, but she knew that her words had made an impact. For the first time, it felt like the truth was being heard. The lawmen might not be done yet, but this was a step in the right direction. As the group turned to leave, Takoda looked up at her with a quiet smile. You did it, he said softly. The woman nodded, her heart swelling with pride. We did it, she corrected. Together. And as they walked out of the sheriff's office and into the sunlight, she felt a sense of peace settle over her. The battle wasn't over yet, but they had won this moment. And that was enough to keep moving forward. Weeks passed, and though the threat from the lawmen still lingered like a dark cloud on the horizon, the woman felt a sense of relief that she hadn't known before. The sheriff's visit to the mayor had, surprisingly, led to a change. Slowly, the word spread through the town, and it became clear that the lawmen had no more support for their unjust actions. The woman had done what she could. She had stood her ground, and in doing so, she had made a difference. The Apache warriors had left, but their influence remained. In the days that followed, a new sense of unity began to form in the town. More people spoke up about the wrongs they had seen, about the injustices they had witnessed, and, bit by bit, the town started to change. Takoda, for the first time since the lawmen had come for him, began to smile again. He helped the woman with the chores around the cabin, but he also began to teach her things about the Apache way. He shared stories from his people's past, stories of strength and resilience, and she listened intently. Slowly, they became not just protector and protected, but friends. One evening, as the sun set over the distant mountains, Takoda sat beside the woman by the fire. The crackling of the flames filled the quiet space between them. Do you think they'll ever understand? He asked softly, his gaze fixed on the fire. The woman looked at him, her heart swelling with pride. I think they're starting to, she said, her voice steady but filled with hope. It's not going to happen overnight, but change is possible. You prove that, Takoda. Takoda smiled slightly, his eyes reflecting the warmth of the fire. "It's not just me," he said quietly. "You did it too. You made them see what was right." The woman placed a hand on his shoulder. "We did it together," she said. "And we'll keep fighting for what's right. Not just for you, but for everyone." As the days turned into weeks, the town's transformation continued. The lawmen who had once been so determined to silence the Apache people found themselves losing support. They were replaced by a new sense of justice, one where people like Takoda were no longer seen as outsiders. The woman knew that the road ahead would still be difficult, but for the first time in a long while, she felt hopeful. The weight of the world no longer seemed so heavy. They had made a difference, and that difference would continue to grow. One afternoon, as the woman was working in the garden, she heard the sound of hooves approaching once again. But this time, it was different. Instead of the harsh, oppressive sound of the lawmen's horses, she heard the rhythmic, steady beat of hooves that brought a smile to her face. She looked up to see a group of Apache riders coming down the road, their faces familiar. At the front was the leader, who had stood by her side when the lawman had come to her door. He dismounted gracefully and walked toward her. "We have not forgotten you," he said, his voice filled with gratitude. The woman stood, wiping her hands on her apron. "I didn't do it for thanks," she said softly. "I did it because it was the right thing to do." The Apache leader smiled. "And you did it well," he said. "The changes in the town are not just because of us. They are because of you." Takoda came up behind the woman, his expression full of pride as he looked at the Apache warriors. "What happens now?" he asked, his voice curious. The leader of the Apache riders turned to Takoda, his expression softening. "Now, we have the chance to live in peace," he said. "To live as we were meant to. But we will always remember those who fought alongside us." The woman felt a sense of contentment settle over her. The battle wasn't over, but they had won this fight. Together, they had built something new, something strong and just. The world around them had begun to change, and for the first time in a long time, the woman felt like she was part of something larger than herself. "Thank you," she said quietly, looking at the Apache leader. "For everything." He nodded, his face filled with gratitude. "We will always be grateful to you. You are a part of our people now." As the sun dipped below the horizon, the woman looked out across the land, feeling the weight of the journey she had taken. It had been long and difficult, but it had brought her to this moment, a moment of peace and hope. The world was still full of challenges, but she knew now that there was always a chance for change. And as the Apache warriors rode off into the distance, she knew that their paths would cross again, that their fight for justice would continue. But for now, they had won a victory, one that would echo through the town for years to come. The woman stood tall, Takoda by her side, ready to face whatever came next. Together, they had made a difference. And together, they would keep fighting for what was right.